Nearly 100,000 Japanese Americans were detained by the U.S. during World War II. They were deemed the enemy. Men, women, and children taken by bus and train to camps across the country, spending years within barbed wire. It's one of the darker moments in this country's history, and in tonight's Prime Focus, ABC's Juju Chang brings us that story through the eyes of someone who lived it and is now working to preserve that history for future generations.
One time I was asked, what does it feel like? Well, just looking at this, can you imagine? You know, just standing here, after a few minutes, I actually could remember. I can even visualize this. There is so much in my history deep-seated that's coming forth from all of this experience. It's just taken me a few years to even call it an incarceration camp.
Carlene Tannegoshi Tinker was just 3 years old when she first walked these grounds. Just weeks after Japanese pilots bombed Pearl Harbor. The onset of some of the darkest years in modern history, with one painful chapter written right here on our own soil, a part of history that was kept in the shadows, now refusing to be forgotten.
So in these four corners is where your family lived?
Not very big.
No, not at all.
Yeah, and can you imagine, this was one of the larger ones.
Wow.
Yeah.
And families of 4 or 5,
oh, yeah.
7 would share one.
Right, right.
Carlene was among the 100,000 Japanese Americans detained by the U.S. government during World War II. They were deemed the enemy. Carlene was just a toddler. She and her family were incarcerated here in Amache, a camp 200 miles from Denver in the eastern plains of Colorado.
Growing up, your parents didn't talk about Amache.
That's right.
Why do you think that generation wanted to forget?
They don't look back. They don't, you know, it was what it was. Certainly there was shame. My goodness, you're labeled the enemy. Oh my gosh, you didn't do anything wrong.
Her parents, both citizens, worked in a farmer's market.
I was born in a Hollywood hospital. I like to say that because it sounds pretty neat, but I think it was just a regular hospital. Of course, I don't remember any of this, but they lived in Boyle Heights, which was a very popular area in Los Angeles for Japanese Americans. We lived there until the evacuation order that President Roosevelt signed at that time after Pearl Harbor. A lot of people lost their farms, their businesses. They're very evil people. They haven't done anything wrong, but you don't know. They're going to do it sometime. So that was the rationale that they used to put us behind barbed wire.
More than 10,000 people were imprisoned at Camp Amache between 1942 and 1945. Two-thirds of them were American citizens. Many, like Carlene, were children.
What do you remember of this space? What were those memories that came back?
Well, if you can think of it as, let's say we divide the apartment in half.
In half, yeah.
Right, like this. And strung from one side to the other would be a cord. And over that cord would be a blanket. That would divide the bedroom from the living room. And then each block had a mess hall. We would stand in line, and I guess sometimes several hours.
Just for a meal?
Yeah, just for a meal. In the latrines, there were no partitions to separate any toilet. So some people waited until very late at night, and then they would go to the bathroom and or go to the showers.
The majority of those held at Amache came from California's Central Valley. Teachers, professionals, along with mostly farm workers. Despite the repressive living conditions, they nurtured flowers and vegetables. They ran shops, schools, published a newspaper. And when the War Department came calling, many also volunteered to enlist.
There was a 10% volunteer rate to fight in the war. This was the highest rate of volunteerism to go fight.
Yeah.
What does that tell you about the people who were here?
Yeah, it tells me a lot. It tells me that they were trying to prove their loyalty in spite of the fact that their parents, their families were being incarcerated.
That they were loyal Americans.
That's right.
953 men and women from Amache joined the military during World War II. 105 of them were wounded, 31 killed in action. 2 months after the U.S. dropped nuclear bombs over Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the Amache internees were ordered to evacuate the camp. After 3 years behind barbed wire, they were told to go back to their old lives after being stripped of everything they had. Amache was abandoned, and what happened here buried in sand and grass.
We gather here today to right a grave wrong.
Nearly 50 years later, the U.S. government apologized to Japanese Americans and granted token reparations. Back in the small town of Grenada, Colorado, one teacher started researching what happened down the road from his school at Camp Amache.
They had a fire department, police.
John Hopper taught social studies and coached 3 varsity sports. He also coached his students little by little to uncover the forgotten history at Amache.
What drew your attention to it?
It was kind of fate. My mother actually worked with a former internee. His name was Emery Nomura. So, you know, we knew about it. So I get hired here as a young teacher, and I want to do a history project. I'm less than a quarter mile away from Amache here. I know I can interview Mr. Nomura. Let's go. And that's what we did. The object was to collect as many stories and primary sources that we could.
What year was that?
1994 or 1995.
Before the internet, for sure.
Oh, yeah. I mean, we're using cassette tapes.
One suitcase per person.
What started as an oral history project at the only school in Grenada, population 400, blossomed into a full-blown museum.
Made in concentration camp, 1944.
People started giving us stuff. And our first museum was actually on our campus.
The interesting thing was
The high schoolers became historians, museum guides.
this is a crib that a baby slept in, and it was donated by the baby who slept in it.
Oh my goodness.
Together, John and his students took on a monumental task, one the federal government had yet to take on, to preserve and restore the essence of the camp.
My students took care of the site. We mowed, we trimmed trees, we fixed roads, we painted, we did a lot of work up there, and then plus we ran the museum. I mean, not many high school projects turn into full taking care of a historic site. Well, I've been looking.
They started the Amache Preservation Society, and with the help of other organizations, recovered key landmarks like the water tower, a guard tower, and a barrack. John's students traveled all over Colorado, Kansas, and Oklahoma to educate others about Amache.
There were a few people that weren't too happy that we were doing what we were doing.
What made them unhappy?
Well, they didn't want it brought up into the history kind of thing. They just wanted to keep it pushed down. I mean, I would shed tears on some of the stories of people, you know, and it's like...
It got under your skin.
It did. It really did. I'm a champion of the cause to make sure that everybody understands what happened so it doesn't happen again.
For Amache's survivors and their descendants, John and his students' work has allowed them to come back to a living memorial to share their stories.
Wow. What do you feel when you step into here?
Oh, vivid memories.
Yeah.
Vivid memories.
It's like they come
I
flying.
could be lying over there on my blankie. Yeah, but I can remember like being over here and looking. I can still see that.
That's incredible.
Isn't that amazing?
Yeah.
You don't think of those things until you're there.
Yeah.
Carlene started coming back in the early 2000s as part of Denver University's Field School and the annual return to Amache.
Many survivors.
This year's pilgrimage is particularly special. Carlene, along with other survivors and descendants, are back to celebrate a milestone.
I'm especially honored to be here with survivors and families. This is their story.
After decades of work to preserve the memory of Amache, the Biden administration has declared the camp a National Historic Site.
You know, as we look across and we can celebrate our immigrant history as Americans at the Statue of Liberty, we also need to look at the darker chapters.
What is the story of Amache? What happened on this little prairie?
Amache represents the fortitude of 7,000 or more people who came obediently, not willingly, but obediently, even though they were being treated as enemies.
What is the ribbon cutting going to mean to you?
Finally, we get to tell our story. But not only that, it preserves the stories that people have contributed, and when we're gone, it will perpetuate those stories.
Certainly stories worth being remembered. Our thanks to Juju for that.